Welcome to Get Your Books Out, and thank you for joining us. Bringing you the best books you may have never heard of from the world of land, sea and air. Gripping adventure stories and tales of military daring-do, tomfoolery, incompetence and genius. If you like our channel, please share, like and subscribe. Chapter 2. Staff Work Run Mad. The blame for much of the discontent must sit squarely on the shoulders of the Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, Admiral Sir Roger Keyes. Keyes was a remarkable man. He was absorbed by his family tree which, he claimed, led in a direct line from the Norman conquest. His father had been a general, his mother the sister of a field marshal. Almost from the moment that he entered the Navy as a cadet, he seemed determined to prove himself the greatest Keyes of them all. As a junior officer, he barged his way forward through the ranks of his fellows. He made a point of being the first to volunteer for any situation that promised danger and distinction. If being the first volunteer did not always succeed in furthering his plans, he was quite capable of disobeying orders and embarking on the adventure on his own account. For a while he walked the tightrope between disgrace and honour. He was alternately arousing the fury of his senior officers or gaining their reluctant admiration. If he had decided to go into business nowadays, he would certainly have ended up the most sensational bankrupt or a man of great wealth. As it happened, his luck held. But it was not only luck. He often displayed great physical courage. Most certainly he was not popular with many of his contemporaries. In their eyes he was brash and, worse still, a pusher. But his superiors respected his ability, his enterprise, and his seamanship. Promotion came fast. He was elevated in rank years before those fellow cadets with whom he had once served. Then came the First World War, and his qualities of audacity, enterprise, and above all, success, made him a national hero. It was even suggested that he should be awarded the Victoria Cross, but he never received it. Keyes' father had also been nominated for the medal in his time, equally unsuccessfully. However, a Victoria Cross was eventually awarded to the Keyes family in the Second World War. Keyes' son, Major Geoffrey Keyes, won it when leading a commander raid on Field Marshal Rommel's headquarters in North Africa. Sadly, it was a posthumous award. In 1919, Sir Roger Keyes was in an unassailable position so far as the Navy was concerned. His reputation was unchallengeable. He hadn't made enemies on his way to the top, but now they were unimportant. He had also made some powerful friendships. One in particular was with Admiral of the Fleet, Earl Beatty, who held the Navy's supreme appointment as First Sea Lord. Apart from the Navy, they shared another common interest: horses. Both were fanatical about hunting and polo. In fact, Beatty had once put the hunting season before his career. Had the situation arisen, there is little doubt that Keyes would have done the same. In May 1925, at the surprisingly young age of 52, Keyes became Commander-in-Chief of the Mediterranean Fleet, a post commonly regarded as second only to Beatty's. He took with him his wife, his young daughters, and 3 polo ponies. He tried to have the ponies transported to Malta aboard a warship, but eventually had to settle for a merchantman. He had, incidentally, proposed marriage to his future wife several times without success, and was finally accepted on the way back from a morning's hunting. Polo became something of a fetish in Malta. Keyes himself played almost every day. Lady Keyes and her daughters formed themselves into a team called the Bunch of Keyes, and many a socially ambitious young woman who felt that acceptance of Admiralty House was by way of a ladder of polo saddles started wearing jodhpurs. Young officers, if not exactly expected to play, were certainly given every encouragement, for it was Keyes' firmly held belief that the dash and spirit learned on the polo ground were the finest possible training for life in a warship. Some of the officers took happily to the new regime. Others resented the preoccupation with horses and the chafing it aroused in the rest of the Navy, for legends of the new regime in the Mediterranean spread fast. One young officer appointed to the fleet is said to have reported on board his ship with a polo mallet under one arm and a copy of Debrett under the other. This story has been repeated so many times in the written reminiscences of officers who served in the Mediterranean at the time that it seems highly likely to be true, and unquestionably the periodical publication of promotions soon, and rather sourly, became known as polo promotions. There was one ambitious and hard-riding officer who highly approved of all this horsiness. He was Lieutenant Commander Lord Louis Mountbatten, Signals and Wireless Telegraphy Officer aboard HMS Stuart, leader of the 2nd Destroyer Flotilla. Earlier on, Mountbatten, having married into a great deal of money, had been posted to a naval signal school where he had arrived in a spanking new Rolls-Royce, in which the car's famous bonnet mascot had been replaced at Mountbatten's behest by the gilded figure of a blue jacket holding semaphore flags. His contemporaries, hard-pressed to afford small sports cars, regarded the Rolls-Royce as a downright ostentatious and the mascot as unspeakably vulgar. This made not a scrap of difference to Mountbatten, and by the time he left the school he had written a manual on signalling that was used by the Navy for a long time afterwards. Now he was in Malta, playing polo day after day, and was soon to write a textbook on that subject too. Mountbatten was the type of officer who warmed Keyes' heart. Titled, capable, and enterprising, and, like himself, not always popular. There is no doubt at all that the polo set, and the growing throng of Admiralty House titled intimates, was irksome to many senior officers and commanders of ships in the fleet. But there was no quarrel with Keyes himself. He was a sailor's sailor, and had proved it over and over again. The Commander-in-Chief was no orator. More often than not, he was completely tongue-tied. He was known to board a ship in harbour, mount a well-burnished and newly painted capstan, survey the assembled officers and men before him, pause for an interminable time, give a few quiet, incoherent grunts, shuffle off the capstan and disappear. He was loved for it. Action, not words, was his reputation. Keyes revelled in his new appointment. He was forever writing copious letters inviting friends and acquaintances, usually influential, to come and holiday on the island and share his pleasures. Bridgeman, the First Lord of the Admiralty, and Beatty, the First Sea Lord, were asked. His future King and Queen, the Duke and Duchess of York, paid a visit. The Duke played polo. Keyes even suggested that Winston Churchill should borrow his official yacht, the converted sloop Bryony, for a cruise. That yacht was one of his particular joys. He would often sail in her in company of the fleet, taking along as many of his family and friends as the accommodation would allow. Unfortunately, she rolled like a tub. Keyes was happy, and as a man he was popular. It was his method of command that caused the trouble in the Mediterranean fleet, particularly his belief in delegation. No commander-in-chief of a force the size of the Mediterranean fleet can attend to even every major detail. He must have men around him who can be trusted, and who better than old allies. Not long after he was appointed as commander-in-chief, Keyes wrote to one of them, John Joe Kelly, and invited him to become his second-in-command. Kelly answered by saying how much he would like the job, but that, in all honesty, he had to point out that he knew absolutely nothing about handling a fleet or fleet tactics. Besides that, he was inarticulate and could not put two words together. One word, he wrote, then a splutter, and then nothing. This latter failing was hardly likely to deter Keyes. He persuaded Kelly to join him. These two men surrounded themselves with a highly efficient staff, far too efficient perhaps, for it led to a bureaucracy of which the civil service would have been proud, and to endless paperwork. The fleet was bombarded with every conceivable form of written order, accounting for almost every movement in a ship's working day. Daily reports and returns were demanded for the most trivial reasons. As one captain said wryly, the only decision left to him was what to eat for breakfast. Men brought up to exercise their initiative in command found all this irritating, and that irritation was bound to affect their harassed subordinates. A couple of years later, a new commander-in-chief was to survey the Malta scene and describe it as staff work run mad. But no guest attending those dances and cocktail parties ever realised this. The Mediterranean fleet always wore a bland and hospitable expression. It was in this atmosphere that, around Christmas 1927, Rear Admiral Collard, Captain Dewar, and Commander Daniel, virtual strangers to each other, joined Royal Oak, and soon afterwards, the officers of the ship decided that they should hold a dance. So began a farce that was to bring a deep blush to the Navy's face. A farce that became a tragedy for one promising officer, blighted the career of another, wrecked that of a third, smeared several others, and even destroyed the ambitions of the Commander-in-Chief himself, and left one entirely innocent man with a sense of remorse that he would never forget. That man was Percy Barnacle, Royal Marine Bandmaster, First Class. Chapter 3. Royal Oak requests the pleasure. It was in December 1927 that Collard, Dewar and Daniel met aboard Royal Oak. Save that summer in the past, Dewar and Daniel had spent a few days in the same ship. The men had never served together. Bandmaster Barnacle had been a member of the ship's company for some time. Collard had only recently been promoted to the rank of Rear Admiral, and this was his first flag command. It was a post with a minimum of responsibility, for the 1st Battle Squadron was so well drilled, so highly organised, so well greased and oiled, that it would be scant authority for a new flag officer to exercise. But it was good blooding for real power later. Collard, the son of a Dorset parson, was 51 years old when he was piped aboard his new flagship on the 13th of November 1927. He looked every short inch the part of a senior naval officer. He might have been small in stature, but he was very stocky. His dark hair was beginning to thin, over a nose as sharp as a sparrow's beak. His blue eyes were keen. His early days had been spent in sail, and he had a bellow of a voice and a vivid vocabulary to prove it. He liked his eating and drinking. He could be sociable and amiably bluff, but owned a notoriously testy temper. There was, however, much more to him than that. When he first went to sea, the Royal Navy's god was paint and polish. The discovery of a new formula for a hard-drying enamel was, at the very least, just as important as the invention of the torpedo. There were even tales told, with considerable evidence to back them, that warships sent to sea on firing exercises would dump their ammunition over the side, rather than have the gun barrels scorched and blistered. It was a situation that could not last, though at first only a few of the brighter young officers realised it. These few saw that promotion and advancement would come only through specialisation. Merely to be a good seaman and a supervisor of brass polishing was not enough. The subject they chose was the much scorned gunnery, and they were to be proved right. Their star ascended with the coming of the First World War. So did their careers. Collard was intelligent enough to be one of these junior officers. He studied hard and learnt his subject. He passed each course with distinction. But one of his first distinctions was not happy. While serving as an instructor lieutenant at Whale Island, known throughout the Navy by the slogan, "Gas, Guns and Gaiters," he was supervising a party of seamen when it began to rain heavily. The men broke ranks and ran for cover. Angrily, Collard called them back and shouted the order, "On the knee!" The men returned to their places and knelt, all save one seaman who refused. "On the knee, you dirty dog!" demanded Collard. There in the rain, the man submitted. The incident had been noticed, and Collard was charged with administering an unauthorised punishment and court-martialed. His defence was that the order "on the knee" was a traditional command, hallowed in old instructional manuals and merely designed to give an officer a clear view of his men's faces. Knowing Collard's he in his study, court found it hard to doubt his evidence, though older officers swore that they had never heard of the order. In the end, Collard was found guilty and sentenced to be reprimanded. Even such light censure could mar an officer's career, but it did Collard little harm and brought virtually no frown from the Admiralty. It certainly earned him a reputation of sorts. Years later, the wife of a future admiral who met him in Gibraltar referred to him as that peppery little on-the-knee Collard. There was no disputing the man's courage. As a young midshipman, he had earned a testimonial from the Royal Humane Society for saving a seaman from drowning. At one stage during the First World War, he had been a beachmaster on W Beach at Cape Helles in the Dardanelles. While any sane man leaves the perils of an invasion beach as rapidly as the situation will allow, Collard's duty was to remain there, and that he did until he was wounded. He returned from that bloody enterprise with a permanent limp and wearing the ribbon of the Distinguished Service Order. So, on a November Saturday morning in 1927, the Royal Navy's latest and newest flag officer boarded the massive battleship, HMS Royal Oak, specially scrubbed and immaculate for the occasion. The moment he set foot on deck, the symbol of his new authority, a crisp white flag bearing the Scarlet Cross of St. George with its 2 scarlet balls, was hoisted. The silver boatswain's calls twittered and shrilled, echoing from Grand Harbour's walls and battlements. A moment that any man would treasure. Surely so. But as Collard surveyed Kenneth Dewar, his new flag captain, standing stiffly to attention, his sleeve with its 4 gold rings at the salute, was there a flaw to the moment, a distinct blue bottle in the jam? Very likely, for Rear Admiral Collard had an acute sense of what was proper. By custom, every flag officer was allowed to choose his own staff, his flag lieutenant, secretaries and communications officers. Above all, he had a say in the choice of his right-hand man, the flag captain, the officer who would command his flagship. But Collard had had no say at all in Dewar's selection. The Naval Secretary had written to him suggesting that he took Dewar, for it would be very difficult to substitute him. There was some sound sense in the Naval Secretary's argument. Dewar was very senior in the list of captains, and if he were to gain promotion to flag rank himself, it was important that he accumulated the qualifying time of command at sea. Collard replied that he had no objection, but added, with a typical touch, that he hoped the Naval Secretary would not tell Dewar that they had asked for him. He then received a letter from the First Lord of the Admiralty himself, notifying him that Dewar had got the appointment. It was not what the Navy's newest Rear Admiral would have wished. Captain Kenneth Gilbert Balmain Dewar was 48 years old and as tall as Collard was short. His straight fair hair, now beginning to turn grey, was always meticulously parted down the centre in a line as straight as the set of his mouth. The son of a prosperous Scottish doctor and educated in Edinburgh, Dewar was a thinker, what his fellow officers could call an ex-chaser. Like Collard, he had specialised in gunnery, but had gone further and later devoted himself to the study of naval strategy. He was a quiet, haughty, somewhat withdrawn man. One admiral who knew him well said that Dewar came from the Kingdom of Fife, where men are born getting out of bed on the wrong side and spend all their lives trying to get over it. He usually made himself so unobtrusive that, even as captain, many of his ship's company were unaware that he was on board for days on end. Yet, for all his reticence, he was capable of getting himself into extremely hot water. His notions on strategy were mainly to blame. Invited to read a paper before a gathering of senior officers at Staff College, he had delivered a highly critical lecture instead. He had argued that naval thinking was out of date. Nelson had evolved his battle tactics because his ships were ruled by the wind. There was no excuse for them being slavishly followed so many years afterwards. Senior officers disliked being criticised, even by inference, and Dewar was regarded by most of his audience as an impertinent young pup. But there were others, important names among them, who shared his views and supported him. Such backing and his own ability had given him command of Royal Oak. He joined her on the 6th of November, exactly a week before Collard. Commander Henry Martin Daniel, DSO, the third of the trio, was also a gunnery expert. He was just 39 years of age and joined Royal Oak on Christmas Eve, more than a month after Collard and Daniel. But while they had no recent experience of naval life in Malta, he was an old Mediterranean hand. The commander's job aboard a warship, particularly a battleship and especially a flagship, is no sinecure. His whole career depends on the success he makes of it. The Admiral is, in some respects, a passenger aboard his own flagship, albeit a most influential passenger. Rather like the chairman of an airline who books a flight aboard one of his company's aircraft. Collard's primary concern was with the group of ships he commanded. It was Dewar's task to run the Royal Oak. Like any other commander in his position, it was Daniel's duty to carry out his captain's wishes. More than that, to anticipate them, and to inspire the whole ship's company to such a height of efficiency that Dewar could regard his ship contentedly, and Collard look on his flagship with approval. In the Royal Navy, promotion to the rank of Lieutenant Commander is by seniority, and after that by selection. Daniel had cleared the first hurdle. He had been a commander for 5.5 years when he joined Royal Oak. Whether he ever became a captain or not would depend very largely on what Collard and Dewar thought of him. Tall, with fair crinkled hair and ears pointed in rather elfin fashion, Daniel was a competent officer and cool in action. He had seen a great deal of that, having served practically the whole of the late war at sea. Besides being awarded the Distinguished Service Order, he had been mentioned in dispatches. He was also a specimen of some curiosity in a naval wardroom before. As a practicing Christian Scientist, he openly prayed for his fellow officers and in a previous ship had actually held prayer meetings on the lower deck. This could hardly have gone down well with Dewar, who was a firm Roman Catholic, and according to at least one colleague, a very superior person. Daniel was a sanctimonious man, and on occasion could be most temperamental. To add to all this, he was a frustrated playwright and an impresario. The Navy was fond of its shipboard entertainment and its amateur dramatics, and it never had a more ardent sketch writer, stage manager, and producer than Daniel. The Navy also had a splendid reputation for entertaining the outside world. Wherever it sailed, its hospitality was renowned. From formal and diplomatic occasions when foreign potentates were all entertained, to summer cocktail parties when showing the flag off some seaside holiday resort, not forgetting dances on board ship in any port the fleet might be based. Then there were the children's parties, when gun turrets would be spectacularly disguised as huge elephants, and canvas chutes rigged to become exciting slides. In a place like Malta, ships were judged by their sociability and hospitality as much as they were by their seagoing efficiency, and it was generally recognised that any vessel fortunate enough to have Daniel aboard to organise affairs was a very lucky ship indeed. His parties were spectacular. He once arranged a fancy dress dance with the opera Die Fledermaus as a theme, and spent most of the night dressed as a spectacular bat, clinging to the underside of the quarterdeck awnings over the dancers' heads. Percy Barnacle was promoted to Royal Marine Bandmaster, First Class, aboard Royal Oak on the 14th of November 1928, at the age of 35, just one day after Collard joined her. Physically, he and his admiral were much alike, for Barnacle was just 5 feet 6 inches tall and almost as stocky. There the similarity ended. Barnacle was a quiet and modest man, never heard to swear. He was a deeply devout Christian with a most unhappy background. His father George served in the British Army Commissariat in Burma. He looked an imposing man with moustaches, high-collared blue frock coat, black braided frogs across his chest, and pillbox cap with its cheese-cutter peak. Before he left Burma to come home and retire, he had no trouble at all in persuading the young daughter of a fellow non-commissioned officer to marry him. Poor girl. All she had known was Burma and a life where even NCOs had servants. London's climate was one of the least of her troubles, as she learnt to shop, polish, and keep house. In addition, she had 2 small children, Percy and his younger sister. George Barnacle eventually found himself a job as foreman with the Lee Valley Water Company. Then, one afternoon, when he was in his 50s and having tea in the kitchen with his family, he had a heart attack and dropped dead. Disaster followed tragedy. The house in which they lived belonged to the company, and widow and children were ordered to quit. Destitute, they had nowhere to go, no one to whom they could turn. They even slept at night under street traders' barrows in London's back streets. It is said that, in her desperation, the widow turned to prostitution. In any case, she did not live long. When he was 8 years old, Percy Barnacle and his small sister found themselves inmates of an orphanage in Salford, Lancashire. Founded by Sir William Barnes, a well-known local philanthropist, it was an enlightened institution by the standards of the day. What is more, it had a band. Percy learnt to play the trombone so well that when he was almost 16 years old, he tried to join the Royal Marines as a band boy. At first, he was rejected as being overage, but when they heard him play, an exception was made. During the war, he was serving in HMS Britannia when she was torpedoed. He was trapped in the gunnery control deep in the heart of the ship. It was an experience that stayed clear and sharp with him ever afterwards. Percy Barnacle was a man who knew his place and never stepped out of it, so all the recent comings and goings aboard Royal Oak, the arrival of Collard, Dewar and Daniel, were no concern of his, or so he thought. He was also a busy man. Apart from his routine duties, he was trying to turn a group of volunteer sailors into a passable jazz band. Like her 4 sister ships, Royal Oak was designed to serve as a flagship from time to time. There might have been some shuffling of cabins to accommodate the Admiral's staff, but Collard's own quarters were spacious and splendid. His day cabin alone was as large as any liner's stateroom, and considerably roomier than most. It was located in the stern, on the upper deck, immediately below the quarterdeck. It extended the full width of the ship and was very comfortably furnished with well-stuffed sofas and armchairs. Collard's roll-top writing desk, complete with a bell pushed to summon his staff, was over on the port side. On a warm day, with the ports open to a greater breeze and the sunny reflection of the water in Grand Harbour rippling on the impeccably white enamel deckhead, it must have been a pleasant place in which to run affairs. Through a doorway beside the fireplace and beyond the desk was the Admiral's dining cabin, occupied largely by a 6-foot-long polished table. Beyond that cabin again was Collard's private pantry. His bathroom, sleeping and guest cabins were over on the starboard side. Opposite, and considerably smaller, was Dewar's suite of day and sleeping cabins, extending forward were the quarters of the ship's most senior officers until they reached 2 large compartments either side of the upper deck. These were the Royal Marines' messes in their traditional place. It has always been said, and not always jokingly, that the Marines are situated where they are in order to protect the officers from the ratings berthed at the other end of the ship. Not that Collard had much opportunity to explore his new quarters, at least for a little while. Aided by tugs, Royal Oak, either alone or in company, put to sea nearly every day for training in readiness for the annual combined spring exercises with the Atlantic Fleet, and Collard spent most of the time on his bridge, just above the navigating platform where Dewar was running the ship. Like so many other officers, Collard and Dewar had settled their wives in accommodation ashore and joined them every evening. In the early morning and late afternoon, Grand Harbour became a nautical version of a city commuter rush hour, with the white wakes of launches and barges criss-crossing the churning waters. Though, what with the wailing of the boatswain's calls, there was considerably more ceremony than the mere salute of a doorman when the occupants arrived or departed. From time to time, Collard and Dewar did manage to eat together on board. These meals were rather odd affairs. The Admiral, his bluff and hearty self, his flag captain reticent almost to the point of total silence. Yet they were in harmony except perhaps for one small riffle. Apart from her outward smartness and her workaday efficiency, a ship was judged by her discipline and the blankness of her periodic crime returns. Royal Oak had 3 stokers awaiting decision on a charge of assaulting a petty officer. A very serious charge indeed. Collard was all for having them court-martialed forthwith. Dewar, on the other hand, had listened to the men's story, was inclined to suspect the petty officer's conduct, and had asked for an investigation. Collard said no more about it. They had both been aboard the ship for a month when Christmas came, with the usual children's parties and high jinks. Having only joined Royal Oak on Christmas Eve, Commander Daniel was unable to exercise his flair for organising such events, but his chance was soon to come. On Thursday, 12th of January, the officers were to have a dance. It was a very important event in Royal Oak's social calendar. As a newly appointed flagship, it was her great opportunity to show the whole Mediterranean fleet exactly how such an affair should be conducted. Pride and honour were deeply involved. If Rear Admiral Collard had one paramount fault, it was his utter, total, and unfailing inability to delegate authority. Even as a captain, and later as an admiral, it was rarely sufficient for him to give an order and stand back until it was reported to him that it had been carried out. He could not resist investigating for himself. He had even been known, with many a roar and a bellow, to organise the seating for Sunday service aboard his ship. This habit not only amused the crew, but also endeared him to them. It was not often they had the chance to watch a senior officer wearing an armful of gold braid, personally supervising the placing of a capstan bar, while the junior officer or petty officer who was supposed to do the job stood by helplessly. So, although it was none of his affair, it was far too much to expect Collard to have no say in the forthcoming dance. But perhaps it was his affair after all, for he had decided that, while Royal Oak was in all her festive glory, he would give his first real dinner party aboard that same night. The most junior and most recently appointed flag officer was going to entertain his Commander-in-Chief, Sir Roger Keyes, and Lady Keyes, together with others among Malta's notables. That bell on his desk rarely stopped ringing, and it was always Daniel he wished to see. Up until then, their relationship had been brief and routine. Now Commander Daniel was the man of the hour. Collard demanded that what he called the whiskey bar in the wardroom be closed on the night of the dance. He was well aware that some of the older and more senior officers, particularly those whose wives were not in Malta, regarded dancing as tiresome and would prefer to observe the gaiety on the quarterdeck with a cold eye and promptly go below to the wardroom, order a stiff drink, and have a happy time criticising what they had witnessed. There would be none of that for a start. What there would be were plenty of officers standing by as dancing partners. No wife, no sister, no daughter would be left in loneliness. Collard was adamant. There would be no wallflowers on board his ship. Line after line of coloured lights were rigged. The sacrosanct quarterdeck, bleached almost white through endless scrubbing, found itself treated to a generous dose of French chalk. Flowers and guinea by the armful were ordered. A long bar was set up. Carpet was laid. And under Royal Oak's aftermost pair of 15-inch guns that shadowed the quarterdeck, gleaming painted barrels, their muzzles plugged by gilt and white tampions bearing the motif of a Stuart crown surrounded by oak leaves. A platform for the dance band was rigged. The arrangement was that the Royal Marine Band should play waltzes, foxtrots and such like for 2/3 of the night, and that the newly trained volunteer naval jazz band would perform in between, while the Marines had a break, something to eat and, with any luck, a drink or two. The weather that January Thursday in Malta had not distinguished itself. There had been little sunshine, but the evening was mild and windless, and even to the most sophisticated party-goer among the guests assembling at Custom House steps in Valletta, there was something quite exceptional about an evening aboard a great battleship. The burble of the idling launches as they took their turn to embark their invited cargo, the attentiveness of the young midshipmen commanding them, the impeccable boat-hook drill of the seamen at bow and stern, then the trip across the harbour to the Royal Oak, looming ghostly grey under the night sky. In her pale Mediterranean paintwork, with her quarterdeck brilliantly bright and the strains of Bandmaster Bunnicle's band drifting over the water. The launches arrived alongside the accommodation adders. There were arc lamps to light the way, helping hands were waiting, so were the messmen in their spotless white jackets, handing out silver trays of well-filled glasses. At the sight of all this, even those naval wives who had attended so many shipboard dances, even these who only a couple of hours before had listened to their husbands cursing as they forced reluctant studs into unyieldingly stiff dress shirt fronts, felt that Royal Oak was putting on quite a show. One deck below, in the Admiral's dining cabin, things had gone just as well. The Commander-in-Chief, Sir Roger Keyes, was always an easy guest. So was his wife. The food was good, drink was plentiful, and the conversation robust and cheery, exactly the sort that Keyes and Collard appreciated. His first venture in entertainment at such a level over, Collard saw his guest ashore. He must have been a satisfied man, as he decided to visit the quarterdeck and attend the dance. If so, his satisfaction did not last for long.